Okay, welcome everybody to this seminar about living labs and the experience we made as researchers when implementing living labs in our project. So if I'm saying we, then this means Mette Vaarst from Aarhus University, it's Annick Spaans from ZLTO, and it's Florence Beaugrand from INRA, and myself, Bernadette. I work for FiBL, the Research Institute for Organic Farming in Switzerland. In brief, the aim of this session is firstly sharing our experiences, because we thought that many of you might be in a situation that they'll have to start implementing living labs in a research context. And we are probably not all social scientists or have a similar background. So this is an approach that might be new to you. So what we want to share with you is the processes that take place in a living lab, also how to select stakeholders that are participating in a living lab, and what kind of support is needed, should be provided by those in charge of the living lab, that living lab can be implemented and successfully run. And of course, at the end of this session, we would like to have a short exchange about your experiences and your thoughts about living labs or other participatory multi-stakeholder approaches. So I think we have enough room to discuss also recommendations at the end about the implementation of living labs in a research context. So in brief, what was the aim of the project where we implemented the living labs? So the aim of Roadmap was to support and foster the transition towards a prudent use of antimicrobials in animal production in different contexts, in different production systems, and in different countries across the globe, not exclusively in Europe. And then we were convinced that this needs rethinking of how farmers, but also vets, decide about the use of antimicrobials. We wanted to develop options that encourage a prudent use of antimicrobials in animal production, and of course engage all actors of the food but also drug supply chain in the support of a more prudent use. So we had quite high aims, and then we thought that specifically for the first point, foster the transition towards a prudent use of antimicrobials, but also the last one, engage all the actors along the food and the drug supply chain, should be involved in the development of new strategies and approaches for a prudent use of antimicrobials. So then why working with living labs? So one approach at the beginning of our project was that we were aware of Geel's multi-level perspective, but also on the role, the important role niches and niche innovations play in these systems. So we thought probably at the local level with a group of people, we could or are able to develop something new that is able to have an impact at the overall landscape of antimicrobial use, but also at the socio-technical regime level. So that was kind of a theory that we had when we started working with the living labs in Roadmap. And of course, we knew the goals that we set ourselves at the beginning of Roadmap were quite high. And of course, when setting high goals and looking at complex problems, we need processes of co-creation to develop innovative solutions. And this also needs different perspectives. Also, we aim to involve multiple stakeholders. In the context of roadmap, these were not exclusively practitioners in the sense of farmers. It was also vets that had to be involved. It was research organizations, society, NGOs, citizen, consumers organization, the government had to be involved at local but also national or maybe even international level, and of course the supply chain actors, here named as industries and companies.
So the processes of living labs, we will have an initial question. I think if you click once more, it should come up. Yeah, a starting question or a frame, like, and in this case, the starting question was about reducing or creating more prudent use of antimicrobials that went into the living lab. And it was important to start in the living lab setting the scene and sharing visions, because when all these different stakeholders came in, they had multiple different perspectives and they needed to share and also try to create shared visions about where would this living lab go. And after having shared some visions and setting the scene and said this is where we are going, exploring and negotiating and diagnosing the problem was the next steps, and a completely, what can you say, precondition for find solutions. So co-creation of potential solutions should be the next. In the roadmap project, we created also action labs. So that means groups from the living labs, maybe of other actors or stakeholders in the environment that were involved in animal production in the focus area. These action labs were involved in detailed design of those solutions and trying it out and also evaluating it. And then it went back into the living lab to be evaluated in the living lab and implemented in a new way. And then the loop started again, trying to find out where are we now? Can we set the new scene? Can we share new visions? So, about living labs, Bernadette, what did you know at the beginning of Roadmap about living labs?
Well, when we started writing the proposal, and this is, I don't know, was it in 2018? I didn't know much about living labs, but I've heard of a few projects that had worked with living labs, and I found the way very exciting, attractive, and as I'm convinced that, as I said in the illustration before, for complex problems we need different perspective. I thought it would be great if we could implement that approach into a roadmap, and then we have time to learn jointly about the approach. And this is also why I thought it's a huge opportunity for us to work with the approach and learn in parallel what potential it has. But Annick, how was your situation at the beginning?
Yes, well, I started with the project a bit later, so after the proposal writing. And when I first heard about the living lab concept, I had no clue what it was. So when I was trying to understand it, I thought it was nothing more than just a stakeholder meeting about a certain topic. But now throughout the process, I learned a lot about it, and it's a very interesting approach, and my understanding is much more deeper. So we will talk about it later in this presentation, but I'm also curious about the opinion of Florence. What do you think?
Well, at the beginning of the project, I had different ideas and I could not combine them very well because I saw living labs in different contexts. So, for instance, at the hospital, when the hospital and doctors and nurses try to work with ill people on the way to deal with pathologies. And I could see also living labs in faculties or universities, and it was linked to places. So some places to speak and some places to build and have like 3D printers and something to try new things. So I could not combine it very well. So that was quite new for me. What about you, Mette?
Well, I actually had never heard about living labs before. So, but I had this intuitive feeling that it was like a lot of action research. It was like a concept about trying things out together. I had worked with pharma groups before, and I had not realized that this was really a multi-stakeholder approach, which was very new to me, and I couldn't really figure out how that would work across. So I was also very curious in the beginning to learn about it.
So perhaps let's have a look on what we learned about designing a living lab. So the first thing we had to learn is that the process of the living lab is a non-linear process. So we saw the iterative cycle just a few slides before. So in an innovation process, so we used to have the innovation, and after the innovation is proposed to the end users. In a living lab, the stakeholder and end user co-create the new products and services and work all together from the beginning on. And the innovation are designed, developed, and validated or not. And again, we have trials. So this is an iterative process. The idea to have end users in the cycle is that they may bring their own feeling, their own knowledge, and the way they will potentially use the innovation. And that helps the designers to be aligned with real life settings, actually. And it's something rather difficult to have different kinds of people working together. So they may have different knowledge, different feelings, different perspectives, and even sometimes conflicts of interest. So living labs has to be facilitated. And we've learned that this is a huge work to facilitate a living lab, actually. Another point is that you don't really know what will be the outcome. Actually, coming from the co-design, you may have a rough idea on the beginning of the topic you would like to deal with and the frame the outcome could have, but you may have very surprising outcomes at the end. Well, to summarize, so we've like 3 phases in a living lab. Actually, let's have a drawing about that. So we have a first step, which is building a common understanding, a common vision. And we could see that it took a large part of the living lab setting to build a multi-stakeholder common vision, actually. The innovation, the design of new products and services have to be tailored to local context. And we could also see that stakeholders had many ideas of what could be change or design to reduce the AMU. But actually, afterwards, they had to focus on the outcome they could really impact on. And the reason why is that they afterwards have to experience, to have prototypes, to have trials, and then being able to evaluate and compare the outcome with the actual situation on prudent use of AMI. Well, could you tell us, Mette, what did you need to start your living lab?
I think that the first thing I was thinking about when starting the living lab, that was actually how to identify who to invite to a living lab, what stakeholders should we invite to a living lab, because that at least kicked the first like part of the process. Maybe more could be invited in later, stakeholders, maybe it could be more open, but how to start, who to start with. So yeah, what did you think in Annick in the Netherlands about starting the living lab?
Yes, well, for me, the experience was actually quite similar. The preparation phase was quite important, and you really need to think about how to involve all the important stakeholders that have something to do with the issue addressed, AMU in this case. And also, I think it was quite important to inform all the Living Lab participants about the goal of the Living Lab meetings, and yeah, in order to have a common understanding and motivation of the process, because it was quite an innovative process, very bottom up. So everybody needed to be well informed about this process. Yeah. And what do you think about it, Bernadette?
I think in our case, we worked in the organic sector, and at the beginning for us, it was kind of a challenging situation. What would be our starting question? And then we looked for a starting question that was attractive for us, but also attractive for the sector. And then the idea was to come up with a discussion about how to document the use of antimicrobials in pig production. So that was the main aim, improving the documentation of the use. So well, once we were convinced in our group here at FiBL, we started thinking about solutions to solve that problem. And then we learned that, oh no, it's not us that should come up with solutions. It's the living lab that should start thinking about that. And these actors should contribute to ideas and also strategies on how to better document the antimicrobial consumption in the organic sector. So that was one thing that we needed to, let's say, get out of the roles we have normally, that we as researchers, we find solutions and probably we validate them in a group of farmers. Second thing is, I would say it was the openness also to adapt the starting questions and be open-minded enough to allow probably adjustments to it. And then what was also really relevant in our case was we needed a network, people that know the sector and people we know that they are able to discuss open-mindedly, and that they have the personality that they can contribute to change something and to improve, not to maintain the system as it is. So I think a good network that was needed. And in my institutions, I think the people involved in advisory services, they had a broad network, not only farmers, but also supply chain actors. And I think what was needed in my case also was that the four of us, we developed the Living Lab approach together. So for us, this exchange was needed also to develop an agenda, a plan, what we want to achieve, how often do we meet. And this was also relevant to convince all to participate in the process, so that they know there is a roadmap for Living Labs in the heads of the people that lead that part of the roadmap project. And this is kind of the thing that we've learned during roadmap and the time we were working with people working with living labs. So I think one relevant step that was common to all of the living labs was that we had to tell them that they need to work on the level of common understanding. And I think one thing is common understanding of the process, common understanding also about the starting question. And then what we developed, the four of us, was in a longer process, a guidance document that should be very useful to all those people that planned to work with the living labs. And that this guidance document, of course, it contained a lot of theories, but also very practical tools like a list of criteria for stakeholder selection, how often we expect a living lab to meet in the time of the project. So we said, for example, at least 4 times during the roadmap project. We made a draft for an agenda, what is relevant and what people should have in mind. We suggested some methods and toolkits, how to moderate and how to work in the living lab process. We also provided and developed a list. What are risky things? What is expensive for farmers to do? What should you avoid? Also, because losing animals and need of additional treatments, that's something that's very risky, and these are strategies that we do not want to be tested in a living lab process. And at the end, one of our aims was to learn and also to have a documentation of the living lab process. So we also provided evaluation forms or documents where all the partners could document the process they went through in the living labs. In the guidance document and also in this other discussions, we identified the need of a coordinator of a living lab and a facilitator, could be one person or two. And then what we had during roadmap, that was also part of the information we gave at the beginning, that we will have or offer regular meetings with those people who are in charge of the facilitation or coordination of a living lab. This is relevant because it's inspiring to talk with other people who are in the same situation. It could provide mutual support and, of course, exchange of materials. When it comes to stakeholder selection, in the internet and also in our guidance document, we could provide some criteria for stakeholder selection. So who are they representing and so on. But at the end, I think at the end of roadmap, we have our own criteria. What would we recommend right now as relevant criteria for stakeholder selection? And this is the fact that people should be open-minded and open and interested in a change. But at the beginning, we gave this kind of information, and we achieved that living labs were established in the project. And how many, Florence?
So in the whole project, so we had 12 living labs, and the most striking point was that each living lab was different from the others. So we had a whole variety of species concerned, so like pig, poultry, turkey, cattle, cows. We worked in different countries, so Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, UK, France, Italy, Switzerland, and we had also processes much like living labs in Vietnam and Mozambique. But these living labs were all different because the type of stakeholders invited were different. The outcomes have been different. The facilitation was different. And we had also different levels of strategy explored by the stakeholders in the different living labs. And the speed of the living labs also differed. So we explored a whole range of strategy from farm to fork, actually. So dealing with farmers, farm workers, advice and education for the farmers, for the vet, for the extension services. Levels of the industry and sector was also explored, and we had a whole variety of debate about indicators, labeling, and incentives, and so on. We had also a question for research and development, and also a whole range of debate about the regulation and the way we could interfere with society. As was said, we spent a lot of time building common vision and diagnosis and designing also strategies, and not all the living labs could really have prototypes, have tests, have action labs to evaluate the feasibility of the strategy, but all of them could see that the living lab helped them improve the common vision, the learnings of people, and find new solutions to reduce AMU. With also a way of working together. Could you tell us a word about that, Mette?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Yeah, and that was actually also quite important in a part of this. That was that all the facilitators or coordinators of the living labs met regularly every second month to reflect together about the processes in the very different living labs. They had new roles. Some of the coordinators were actually not used to be in this type of role, so that was very supportive to them, and also to cross fertilize, work on between countries and between living labs. It was not an easy job, because what we worked with in Roadmap was the use of antimicrobials in animal farming, and that was not only about innovating things, as Florence just said. It was also something that was really demanded new strategies and new routines. So it was also quite complex to facilitate such processes. So there was also a lot of tools that should be used, how to learn to work in groups, and that is also something that in those bi-monthly reflective meetings that could be exchanged good ideas how to work, use all kind of tools. Some living labs were working mainly during the COVID period, so they needed also to work online and use, for instance, word clouds and so on. But no matter whether we worked online or in physical rooms, creating of problem trees, solution trees, and sharing visions on stakeholder maps that were created during the project, so that we could kind of discuss different roles in relation to prudent use of antimicrobials, were good tools. And another helpful tool was the use of this ex ante method, where the problem tree was an important part of it to try and create these common visions on what are actually the problems that's needed to identify before we start finding solutions, and what impact do we want to have, and to show an example of one of these are the two examples from two Danish living labs where stakeholders shared their visions, because the visions might be quite different between different stakeholders. So trying to identify potential conflicts of interest, also to share them and to kind of understand how they could be commonality of interest, how different stakeholders could work together to the same goal and to identify this goal. And this is a what can you say, physical flower written, and we also had, like, in creating common vision in word clouds that I think is on the next slide, where common visions were like expressed in this way, so that the road was light for the living lab.
Yes, of course, during this innovative process of the living labs, we experienced some challenges, and I think this picture illustrates it very well. That we were facing, of course, many online meetings during the COVID pandemic. This was quite a challenge because you miss the dynamics, the group dynamics, the interactivity between the people, and the non-verbal communication of the group. However, as Mette already mentioned, it was also an opportunity to work with online tools that supported optimal online meetings. Another challenge was to work with existing groups. For example, this was the case in the Dutch Living Labs, in which the Turkey sector was involved. We experienced this as a challenge because in the beginning, we felt that the Living Lab was just part of the agenda of their own meeting. And this might create less support for the process. And the possibility to invite other participants was experienced as quite limited as well. So for future Living Labs, we have learned to start with a new group in order to stimulate an open and bottom-up process with a high variety of stakeholders, leading to a lot of different perspectives.
So what about the outcomes? Some surprising, some other expected. So first of all, the outcomes at farm level. We had a whole row of strategy and outcomes debated. For instance, we worked on very technical innovations, such as electronic ear tag or an app, so that we may document IMU and pathology and have a better steering of all the process. But we had also a whole range of societal innovation, for instance, on the way the advisors and the vets would help the farmers, for instance, or on the way the farm workers would acknowledge and be able to learn and evolve all together. At the industry level, I would say that we had also innovation aimed at people, such as education, for instance, in Vietnam, organizing training for drug sellers. But we had also a large debate about the indicator, the steering, the way to be able to measure incentives, the AMU, and the way to have vertical coordination in the value chain. What about the regulation, Annick?
Yes, indeed. We also had some living labs about some topics at regulatory level. This was the case in Denmark and in Italy. And in Denmark, they were working on analyzing the current legislation on veterinary treatments with antibiotics and to influence the next legislative framework. And in Italy, they were working on the pig and poultry sector, in which they were working on harmonizing the regional guidelines on prudent AMU in pig and poultry farming, actually, and to get it aligned with the framework of the European legislation on veterinary medicines. We had also some living labs that were working on topics at societal level. In Denmark, they were organizing a roundtable for public debate, as well as initiating dialogues with agricultural colleges and creating a debate in professional environments. And in Switzerland, in the organic sectors, they were working on materials and training courses for vets who need to have knowledge on organic livestock farming, as well as the promotion of the use of complementary medicine in veterinary education and postgraduate training to reach a maximum of active veterinary practitioners.
So looking at all these tables you've seen and the brief overview given by Florence and Annick, what did the Living Labs achieve? So we asked us this question, and I think the first thing that we see is that we brought people together and we established a dialogue. And we, with this multi-stakeholder approach in the animal sector, we brought people together that rarely met and which are not in a constant exchange about their visions and aims. I think this is one of the most relevant achievements, bringing people together and let them talk together. And they should work on a common understanding. So one case in one case, the Living Lab coordinator mentioned that for the first time, all the vets that worked on calf health in a country were sitting together on one table and exchanging what they observe and what they learned and how they can further develop the system. What an achievement. Then, of course, we have this development and testing of trainings for vets that took place in several countries, and in some cases the development of the curriculum was done together with farmers and vets. So it was not exclusively one group of people that came up with a curriculum and then that was the teaching was given. Then we had these policy processes that are normally implemented in a top-down way. So here we had some situations where this implementation of the policy was done in a more participatory way and slight adjustments could be done. And then, of course, we had also some technical tools, which is in a way that was people normally expect from Living Labs. So there is a tool, it is established, tested, and improved during the Living Lab process. So this is the technical innovation, whereas the tools or the achievements before are on the level of social innovations. And what we also achieved is among Living Lab people in roadmap, all the coordinators, the facilitators, and also us, we were very committed to the approach. We learned a lot and we were very enthusiastic about the way how we worked together. That's also an achievement. And this is reflected that some of the Living Labs, not all, but some of the Living Labs will collaborate also when the roadmap project has ended. And I've started talking about that already. We've learned what kind of stakeholders are needed to have a constructive Living Lab process. Of course, we need to have a diversity of actors, but among these diversity of actors, there is a need of flexibility and openness and the interest in a change, and that a system has to improve. And this needs a social competence, an openness, people that have an open mind and are open also as a person and can interact with other people. It's the participation in the process, of course, should be voluntary. No one should be asked or sent by an institution that a person has to participate in the living lab. And what we also see is that specifically in the agro-food sector, but also in the livestock sector specifically, there are, of course, conflicts, but also dependencies along the supply chain actors. In a completely integrated system, as in some country, pig and poultry systems are, a farmer who completely depends on a company who buys all the animals, it's difficult to have a fair and open interaction, because you're probably also a bit reluctant to ask questions to your buyer, critical questions, for example. So this is something that I think is specific to the sector we worked and not a general finding for all living labs. What we also learned is we were all very busy people. And for living lab meetings in 2 years' time, that is kind of a piece that needs organization. And who is in charge? Of course, it needs someone who is in charge. And in most of the cases, this is the research institute involved in the project. But probably not exclusively. The planning the meetings, yes, that's something we can do. It's also managing the processes between the meetings. A lot of things happen between living lab meetings. In our case, it's that small group of actors. They had an idea and they worked on this specific idea and did additional research, or they tried out new things. So we called these small active groups action labs, and they were part of the living labs. But we need to manage this process, and we need to keep in touch with all the people involved in the living labs also all these months where no meeting takes place. And then it's the invitation for the meetings, and what do we do? Is it in person or is it online? So at the beginning, we really had to continue with these online meetings or offer the option, because people were so used to participate exclusively online that it was kind of hard to motivate them to come for an in-person meeting. But I think also what's relevant, it's not all on the side of the research institution. We should delegate activities, and only if people in the living lab also take the ownership over the process and develop something further on their own, that's something that's definitively a huge step forward. But please, again, message is do not underestimate all the work that's needed to make a living lab running. And this goes until the end. And in some cases, you've heard already that living labs will exist beyond roadmap. But it's not the aim of a living lab that it exists forever. Some living labs, they will have an end, and some will continue. But those who will end, of course, at the end, it also needs a good way to finalize the process. So jointly look back what the group has achieved. And that's also something we established in our project, find ways to co-learn and benefit from what other living labs have achieved. And this is why we established a series of international co-learning events. One of them took place in Denmark. And Mette, what happened in Denmark?
In Denmark, we met different living labs that had to do with cattle, and we learned about the similarities and differences of our sector, about the different problems, how we were tackling them, and we learned about the living lab way it worked, and yeah, also discussed how international, like some of these problems and challenges were also of an international character, and that could also be discussed in such a forum. It was actually a great learning experience, and we visited a number of farms together, and also just sharing what we saw and what we observed, and what were also the differences between countries and the commonalities. That was a very good experience. So some of the highlights and some of the conclusions until now, some of it we have already heard. So now we summarize that these roadmap living labs have worked with levels to AMU reduction on different levels: farm and local actor level, sector industry level, governance and regulation level, and societal levels. And living labs, they bring stakeholders together, and they experiment and they negotiate. It's not just about innovation, it's about solving problems and finding new solutions, social and technical solutions to antimicrobial usage. And we have this common learning cycle approach to reach these goals. So a special way of working in the living labs of kind of a learning loop, identifying, working together, and evaluating what we are testing, and so on. And having said that, the 12 different living labs worked also in different ways, because we had different contexts, and we just had what can you say, different aims. So we worked differently, and living labs, they are an adventure, a journey that you go out into, and it can develop in different ways as decided by the participants and stakeholders. They have to be shaped by the context and the stakeholders and the different phases, and that determines the route of it. It's paramount to be able to negotiate. So it's far beyond innovation, and establishing a living lab in itself seems to have an impact. Just the way that dialogue is established between stakeholders and address and articulate the issue, talking about explicitly what do we agree on, but also what don't we agree on, because that is somewhere where we need to negotiate and have a dialogue. So living labs do produce different innovations, some of it unexpected from the beginning. And we never know, we didn't know when we started where we would end. And then also, as Bernadette said before, the real life setting sometimes impacted the living lab work, price levels, other agendas in our countries or in the world, new policies, various things coming up unexpectedly, and also changes in the team employment or new changes among the stakeholder organizations.
Yep. And then what are the take-home messages? So I think if you are involved in a project and you are starting to establishing a living lab, then you have already made probably a step out of your comfort zone. Probably you are still heading for that, but try it out and learn something new about how people discuss and exchange their ideas. And for that, of course, in some cases, we need someone who is a facilitator. And this was, in our case, often the limitation. So we had research institutions, but no facilitation skills. In some cases, these facilitation skills are available at the university or research institute. Sometimes probably you have to explore if there are extension services or similar institutions that can help you in that. It's helpful because facilitators have a lot of tools at hand, and these tools are needed to move away, to forget the normal lines of thinking and to get away from the usual positions. And relevant is in the case of antimicrobial use, the specific thing is that we really have to change things. It's about reducing, it's about replacing, and it's about rethinking the way we use antimicrobials. And stakeholders that are interested in a business as usual, probably they are not the right person to be part in the living labs. But you never know. Make your own experiences. And please also take in mind that these changes, they need time, they are necessary, but sometimes they are also frustrating and difficult. So that's also what we observed in a roadmap. It's not an easy thing, even if we like the process. In some cases, we were really challenged by the questions people asked and ideas they had. What is relevant is, and I think this is also said previously, relevant is a common vision among all the people who participate in the living lab, a common understanding of what is the problem, and then the dialogue between actors who rarely met in their daily business. And here we have tools at hand and the tools often facilitators can provide tools to support all these processes. And I think what we also see is that in these living labs, we worked a lot on the topic of atmosphere. So we wanted to create an atmosphere that every participant is valued and each voice was heard. And this is also something that needs facilitation. So not the loudest voice and not just the powerful actor should rule in these living lab processes. What we see in the context of roadmap, we addressed a topic where Europe is not, it's that the problem is not at local level or regional level. It's a Europe-wide and a global issue, the use of antimicrobials. Animals are traded through Europe, from Denmark to Italy, from Belgium to Poland. So it's not only one actor and actors in one country that are involved. So then from time to time, we were really asking ourselves, these niche innovations, what can they contribute to a business that huge? But we observed that it had an impact. The establishment of a living lab had an impact and it was noticed by a lot of actors. So even if the topic is huge, do not give up. And the living labs can contribute, and this dialogue can contribute to the further development of a sector. This was our tour through the roadmap living lab experience. So first, thank you for your attention. And I'm not pretty sure how we continue, but we would love to discuss with you what you take out of this presentation and what kind of experiences you've made with the living lab approach in research proposals.
Yeah, I think we can proceed with the two questions to discuss in the breakout rooms. But before we proceed, I think there are questions, but I can't see them. Am I correct? Or oh no, there's just a comment.
It's just one
comment.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the African swine fever, not the swine flu. Sorry for that.
Then there's a question, how easy was it to reach a consensus on the outcomes that came out of the living labs?
The consensus within the living labs or between the living labs in roadmap? I'm not sure I understand the question.
I also struggle. It was a process to have a common vision, a common understanding. For example, in my case, it was a discussion if the aim of the process should be no use of antimicrobials or a limited use of antimicrobials. And this took a while until each person articulated what they said and that people tried to understand each other. And at the end, we decided not to go for a zero strategy, but for us to a strategy where we want to have only a limited, a prudent use of antimicrobials. And that process that needed facilitation so that each people could say what she thought, what he thought, and what his personal aims are. And the personal aims are not the aims of a living lab, but of course, they could be shared.
I think if I should say something to this about a consensus, I think it's like sometimes it was not easy to reach a consensus, but it was very important to actually also acknowledge that there were some different views and to be explicit about that, to go on and still try to find some solutions. That is one comment. Another comment is that people, different stakeholders in the living labs sometimes worked on different strategies in parallel. So and presented it to each other. So the focus was like, was also kind of different in the living labs on what people or what participants wanted to work on. There is a question from Lisa Morgans. In your experience, do you think that stakeholder recruitment engagement in approaches like living labs is getting harder? For instance, that people do not want or have time to participate. And that's that is definitely a relevant one. I think it is challenging, especially when there are so many different agendas and people are very busy. Basically, the ideal situation is that those who are participating in a living lab, they kind of have this sense of ownership that this is actually also something that is important for them as an institution or as an organization or as a stakeholder. But I don't know if that was just my comment.
And to be honest, we have not made this experience because in our case, I think it was the first time that such a participatory approach, we call it living labs here, was established in research around animal husbandry and livestock. And this is why we met and a lot of very motivated people at the beginning. And then, as Mette said, there were processes, crises that affected people directly, that limited a bit the potential to participate or their options to participate in the living lab process. But in parallel, I see at the moment there are a lot of living labs, as it is kind of a European-wide strategy. So we do not know how this will further develop. If there's kind of a fatigue that will be established in 3 years' time and people run away when we say living lab. But I think it's all the time attractive that people come together and have the option not only to talk and exchange, it's also to do something jointly, to try out new things. And here I think the living lab approach really offers something. But we will see how it will turn out. In our case, I think the motivation, we observed that the motivation of people was quite high.
And there's a question from Thorsten Siegmeier from Unicastle about how do you convince research funding to fund open outcomes? Is funding a limitation for the degree of openness in your experience? And that's a very good point, because I mean, in our case, in this roadmap project, it was quite open. I mean, we could basically go in the directions that the stakeholders felt were needed, but I think it was also because we used this living lab approach that was written into the project, and it is an EU project, and EU is quite fond of living labs at the moment, to have experiences about how living labs can work and how, what is important for living labs to work. I think that's maybe why this was funded as openly as it was. I don't know what your comments is to that.
Yeah, on the other hand, I think in the roadmap project, we did have the initial question that the goal was to reduce AMU, and we needed to do that with the aid of living labs. Well, if you would like to do it in a really open way, maybe the initial question was also discovered by the group themselves, and not already decided that it would be about AMU. That's just one point. I experienced in the Netherlands. Is it a problem, AMU, in the third sector? Do we need to focus on this right now? So indeed, it can also be a limitation, although the initial question was still quite broad.